Okay, this is my attempt to version 2 to go through the psychopathology revising depression PowerPoint. So I'm hoping now that I will be, first of all, sharing my screen, but second of all, that you will be able to see the slides that I can see when it goes through. So we'll see. Okay, so this is part 1 of 2, and the reason why it's part 1 is because we're focusing on this one on the emotional, behavioural and cognitive characteristics of depression, which you need for psychopathology. And then in part 2, we will focus on the cognitive explanations for and the cognitive approach to treating psychology. So this is what the specification says you have to know. And the reason why I've put one of them emboldened and separated out from the others is just because that's the first one that we're going to be focusing on today. So the key things for depression are that you can explain all the characteristics, those 3 different types, but also that you can be really specific in your knowledge about both Beck and Ellis's approach to explaining depression with the negative triad and other things from Beck, and also the ABC model, and also how the cognitive approach suggests using CBT to treat depression. So that will be in part 2. Okay, so the first thing to think about is whether or not you know and can explain these 4 different types of depression, all of these from the DSM manual and all that you're expected to know. Now, the key thing I would suggest is that you really think about the words and the language in the terms, because the words themselves give you a clue to what kind of depression it is. Obviously, you need to know both ways around, excuse me, so you need to know what the term is and what therefore that term means, but you also need to be able to, if faced with a description of depression, assign the right term and the right type of depression to the description that you've got. So let's have a look at these 4 then. So first of all, you've got the sort of most obvious one in a way, which is just called major depressive disorder. So this is severe but often short-term depression. And think about the word major, and that kind of cues you into the idea of it being severe. Then you've got something called persistent depressive disorder. So just one word different. We had major depressive disorder, now we've got persistent depressive disorder. And persistent depressive disorder, the clue again is in that word persistent. So it persists, it's long term, or sometimes it comes back, it's recurring depression. And it is also often sustained major depression. So it's there for a long time, or it keeps on coming back. Then we've got something called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. Lots of D's there. And again, the key word perhaps is dysregulation. So if you cannot regulate something, you are dysregulated. Think about dysfunctional, that sort of thing. And so not being able to sort of regulate your mood, your temper, perhaps what might remind you of childhood temper tantrums, which is what disruptive mood dysregulation disorder refers to. And then finally, a very specific type of depression, but equally important to know, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So obviously that word premenstrual links into the fact that this is a disruption of mood during or just before menstruation. Okay, so those 4 terms, really important that you know them and you're really confident to match up term with a definition, but likewise just having a definition, just having a description of depression and being able to say that is an example of persistent depressive disorder because it's saying that it keeps coming back over time, for example. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is that once we've gone through this presentation now, that you then look at it again and you stop it and you do something active to try and remember, first of all, those first 4 types of depression. So a really good thing to do, we've talked about it before, you've seen it probably many times, is making flashcards with your term on one side, your definition on the other, and then doing something with those flashcards, really crucially, something like the lightness system, so that you're using a system whereby you are regularly looking at the word in the definition, but you're also doing it in such a way that the ones you know, you're looking at them less often, and the ones you don't know, you're looking at them more often. So just in case you're not clear, I've put a link to the lightness system at the bottom of this PowerPoint slide on YouTube. Okay, again, after this presentation, after you've watched this, go back to the PowerPoint and have a look at these clips. So you've got 3 clips here that are all just really to remind you of that kind of overview, general knowledge of depression. So the first one up here is a YouTuber talking about his depression. So good as just a kind of general introduction, because he talks about some of the symptoms and the behaviours that he found he demonstrated when he developed depression. The middle one is the WHO, the World Health Organization's video, sort of animated video explaining depression, and it uses the black dog analogy, which we had on the very first slide. So that's worth looking at, just again to get yourself back into the world of general characteristics of depression. And then I've put the last one on there, just a link to the Heads Up website. And as it says on the link, 20 male celebrities talking about depression. Just a good overall introduction. And again, lots of them talking about how they felt, what they did, what they couldn't do, and all of that linking into the characteristics of depression. Okay, so here are the characteristics of depression in the most sort of summarized version. So this is a really good slide to use in order to prompt you to be able to explain these things in more detail. If you can just write these words down, but you don't really know what they mean and how they actually play out with regard to depression, then probably that's not going to do you massive amounts of favours in the exam. So have a look at the 3 types of characteristics. Actually, I think here cognitive has been summarised even a bit, possibly a bit thinly, and really there are 3 things that you need to think about for cognitive, but we'll come to that in a minute. But actually, when you look at the other 2, there are 3 things for the behavioural characteristics and the emotional characteristics. So it's easier to remember if you sort of remember them in groups of 3. So for behavioural, we've got changes in activity levels, so thinking about behaviour, changes in sleeping and eating patterns, behaviour, changes in the behaviour of a person so that they are possibly more aggressive. For emotional, the first one that kind of links very directly into the behaviour of aggression is the emotion of anger. So people who are suffering from depression, one of the emotional characteristics that they might demonstrate is anger. The other 2, again, kind of go together in that they're about low emotions, so lowered mood and low self-esteem. And then the last one, we'll come on to the third thing for cognitive in a minute, like I said, but poor concentration and seeing the negative in things. So remember, cognitive is about how we think and we process information. So we're talking about how people with depression tend to process information. Okay, so let's start thinking about the behaviour characteristics then of somebody who is suffering from depression. So these are the key things written out in a bit more detail than on the previous slide that you need to know about and be able to explain and explore when you are writing about depression, or if you are given a scenario and you have to pick out the behavioural characteristics. So if we just have a look, we've got a change of activity levels, and as you might imagine, often that's a lowering of activity levels. So you might expect, as it says here, sufferers of depression have reduced levels of energy, making them lethargic. This has a knock-on effect, with sufferers tending to withdraw from work, education and social life. In extreme cases, this can be so severe that the sufferer cannot get out of bed. So all of that being a lessening, a lowering of the activity levels. However, occasionally you can have an increase of activity levels, and actually someone suffering from depression becomes agitated, unable to relax, might be moving up and down, pacing up and down, constantly slightly moving, and that's called psychomotor agitation. So think about what that word means: the psycho and the motor, the movement, and being agitated in terms of your movement. So that's the first one. The second one is disruption, change to your normal activities with regard to you sleeping and eating. So eating, it could be that you lose weight, you eat less. It could be that you gain weight and you eat more. Sleep, again, can go both ways. So you could sleep less, unable to sleep, and you'll know that word being insomnia, or you could actually sleep more than normal, and that word is called hypersomnia. So think again about the prefix hyper, and that it often suggests a lot of or almost too much of. So that's again another term that you will need to know. And then finally, the behaviour of aggression, and sometimes leading to self-harm. So sometimes, because of the way you're feeling, and we'll come on to the emotional characteristics in a minute, you can behave in a way that is aggressive, and sometimes that aggression is sort of turned onto the sufferer themselves, and then it becomes self-harm. So from these characteristics then, these words are the key words that you need to know. So you need to be able to use the term psychomotor agitation and know really confidently that it's a behavioural characteristic of depression and what it actually means. You need to know what the word insomnia means and what the word hypersomnia means, and again, to link them into the behavioural characteristics of depression. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the emotional characteristics of depression, and again, think in that group of three, and start with the one which links very directly into the behaviour of aggression. And that is the middle one, the emotion of anger. So if you just have a look at what it says here, it talks about sufferers tend to experience more negative emotions, fewer positive emotions, but that experience of negative emotions isn't just sadness, which is linked into the first one, lowered mood. Sufferers of depression also frequently experience anger, sometimes extreme anger, and again, that can be directed at the sufferer themselves, back at themselves, or it could be directed at somebody else, and that feeling of anger becomes that behaviour of aggression. Okay, so if you can remember that, then you're already hitting one behavioural and one emotional characteristic of depression. Okay, so the other two characteristics, emotional characteristics of depression, are quite similar, I think, and they are lowered mood, again, feeling sad for a prolonged period of time. The words that are written here is there's a link with lethargy. We had that in the behavioural characteristic, not feeling able to do anything, a change in activity levels. So linked into this lethargic, sad feeling. And then the third one is lowered self-esteem. So we've got the lowered mood and the lowered self-esteem. Again, feeling a feeling of no self-worth, being worthless, even a feeling of self-loathing. So all of those, you can see how they fit quite closely to behavioural characteristics, but they are distinct because they are about feelings. And then finally, we've got the cognitive characteristics of depression. So again here, think in a group of three. These are all about the way we process information, cognitive to do with thinking. So people who suffer from depression tend to have poor levels of concentration, okay? And that is particularly with regard to what that sufferer's normal level of concentration is. So if they normally find it really hard to concentrate, then maybe it's not going to be indicative of depression. But if normally they would have been able to concentrate on that thing, then that perhaps indicates that something is not right. There's also the cognitive characteristic of both attending to, so focusing on in the first place, and then dwelling on the negative. So if you have a look at the description there, it says, people are more inclined to pay more attention to the negative aspects of a situation and ignore the positives. In other words, they tend to see a glass as half empty rather than half full. And that goes when they're thinking about the past, so they might be more able to recall bad past events rather than good ones. They will focus on the bad things. And then the final cognitive characteristic is absolutist thinking, sometimes called absolute thinking. And again, this is a term that you need to know, like psychomotor agitation and hypersomnia and insomnia. I nearly forgot them then. So absolutist thinking is a detrimental cognitive habit. So it is not good for you, it is bad for you. And it means that you tend to think in very absolute, concrete terms, very black and white, seeing problems as disasters. Okay, so these are the cognitive characteristics. So I'm going to stop sharing my video in a minute for a few minutes and my sound. And I'm going to ask you to have a go at this question. And halfway through, I'll put up the behavioural, the emotional and the cognitive characteristics so that you can help remind yourself of that if you need to. But try and do this without looking back at your notes. So try and do this just from thinking about the characteristics that we've just gone through. Okay, let's have a look. Jessica is a 20-year-old university student. Her parents have been very worried since she returned home for a holiday. They hear Jessica up late into the night and also notice that she appears to have lost quite a bit of weight. Jessica is very sensitive when asked about this and snaps at her parents. In one argument, she says she hates her parents and herself. In another argument, she says she did not enjoy being at university and hates visiting her family. She shows no enthusiasm about returning to university after the holidays, and has been unable to concentrate on a piece of coursework she brought home to work on. Here are your questions. Can you identify the behavioural, the emotional, and the cognitive aspects of Jessica's state? So think back in those groups of 3 in order to help you do that. And then second question, based on the characteristics and how many of them Jessica has, does she have any of them, would you be suggesting that her parents are right to be worried? Okay, so I'm going to turn off my sound and video for 2 minutes while you have a go at doing this question. Okay, I'm just going to add some more things onto the screen just to help you. These are the characteristics. So if you really struggled, have a look at those and see if you can add your answer. I'll just give you another half a minute. Okay, so I hope you found that relatively straightforward. Let's just have a look at an answer and see what you think. So this answer suggests the behavioural aspects are Jessica's verbal aggression and the change to her sleep patterns. The emotional aspects are her anger and lack of enthusiasm. The cognitive aspect is her lack of concentration on her assignment. And based on that, yes, her parents probably should be concerned. But actually, there are some other things as well, aren't there? So you could pick out the fact that she seems to have lost weight. So that would indicate a disruption in her eating, which would be a behavioural characteristic. You could argue, we did have the aggression actually, didn't we? You could argue that there seems to be a lack of self-esteem when she says she hates herself. So that could go in there as well, I think, is a really plausible answer. Okay, so the last thing I would suggest that you do as part of your revision is have a go at answering these questions. So they are questions which I would answer without any notes in front of you. Again, try and test yourself, thinking just about going through those characteristics again, perhaps doing some revision to learn them, then come back and see if you can answer these questions. All short answers, but could you be specific enough and say enough to get your 2 marks, your 3 marks, for question 5, your 4 marks? Okay. So again, have a look at the original PowerPoint or pause it on this screen to do these questions. Okay, thank you very much indeed. This is the first of the 2 that I'm going to put up, and the second one will be about the cognitive approach to explaining depression and the cognitive approach to treating depression. So look out for that one to continue your revision. Thank you. Bye-bye.